It's a great pleasure to be with you this morning, and I'm really looking forward to the debate with the other two speakers on this panel, because I think actually the topics that we will all be speaking about fit very well together to provide a full picture of the challenges that Europe is facing in terms of foreign policy, both in a very long-term geostrategic, geo-economic environment and the shifts that it is undergoing, but also with regards to the acute and very deep security crisis we currently have in our continent since Russia invaded Ukraine just a few days ago. So, speaking about Europe between China and the US, I think I would like to do three things. The first one is to actually picture China as it looks from Europe. What kind of player is China from a European perspective? And from that, I would like to explain the policies that the European Union or individual member states have so far embarked upon. This does not go without setting China and the European relationship in the context of transatlantic relations. So I will comment on how the dynamic between the three evolved over the past years. And then finally, I will look at China and Russia because, the situation right now is, of course, in the current situation, this question is of strategic importance from a European perspective and from an American perspective, how the relationship between China and Russia will play out in the future. Now, let me start with my first part, and that is what kind of actor, what kind of partner, what kind of competitor is China for Europe? I think the most important thing to recognize is that Europe and some of its member states, in particular Germany, as you said, I'm speaking to you from Berlin, has a very close and long-standing economic relationship with China, including deep financial ties, direct foreign investment. It's not only a trade relationship, but it's really close cooperation also in the area of research and innovation. And this has grown over years. China was never really transparent on the goals it was pursuing in Europe and on a global level. And I think what came as a theme too late to the policy debate about China was this notion of China being a strategic competitor to Europe and the US, basically to the political West. So for a long time, the debate about China from a European perspective mainly focused on the indeed mutually beneficial economic relationship. And the debate about China as a security actor, the whole question of the Indo-Pacific from a security perspective. And then finally, this element of strategic competition, which by now plays out very visibly, even within the European Union and its member states. This only was added to the picture of China at a later point in time. And this makes it so difficult, or made it so difficult for Europe to add to its policies of economic ties and financial ties and joint projects with China, this element of protection against a country that very strategically pursues not only its own growth model and its own autocratic governance style, but also tries to export this model through regulation, through influence, political influence on other states, through presence to such an extent in EU states that it can actually influence votes. So it really tried to export its own model and does so also in international organizations. So while when the United States took a more and more, how can I put it, first of all, realistic, but then aggressive stance vis-a-vis China, for Europeans, it was at the beginning quite hard to digest. I'll give two examples of where the US debate was seen with a lot of caution or even skepticism in Europe. One was the theme of economically decoupling from China. This concept was very much pushed by President Trump, who took a very aggressive stance on China and made it very clear to Europeans that there's an expectation that Europe would align with the United States, but under the terms defined in Washington. So this idea of economic decoupling, which I think doesn't even make sense for the United States, even makes less sense for the Europeans, because while it is, of course, of the essence to have more strategic autonomy vis-a-vis China from a European perspective, a complete decoupling of the economies would come at a huge price and can't be realized so quickly. The second notion that the United States, in a way, introduced into the European debate was that China is a security threat. The issue where this became most visible on was the question whether the Chinese telecoms company Huawei should be allowed to deliver 5G infrastructure in Europe and could be included in the 5G networks as a provider. Some European member states had actually already taken the decision that it could. And there was enormous political pressure coming out of DC on some member states, basically telling them that if they would do this, then the US has to restrict its cooperation, for instance, in the area of intelligence with those countries, because the perception was that this procurement by the Chinese would actually represent a substantive security threat. So I would say today, the debate in Europe on China has substantively shifted, and so have policies. First of all, the risk assessment of what China represents to Europe is much more aligned with the assessment that the United States have. That doesn't mean that policy responses are all the same, but there is generally a quite solid transatlantic understanding that one has to protect not only national democracies, but also institutions in the international order, which was very much shaped on principles of international law, that they have to be protected against Chinese influence that seeks to undermine them. And here's a shift from the Trump to the Biden presidency, because Donald Trump did not pay particular attention to the strength and sanity of international organizations. Quite the contrary, he actually actively undermined them. And so this was not an issue for the US administration at the time that China would do the same. But with the Biden administration bringing back a rules-based international order based on liberal principles as really something the US stands for and wants to work for with other aligned partners throughout the world, China in that regard is framed as a competitor with whom one needs to cooperate. For instance, on the climate agenda, it's essential to work with China. But in other ways, there is more of a, now I would say, normative confrontation between the group of democracies that the US has built around it. And there was the Summit for Democracy at the end of last year, and China as a player that works against some of these norms. Europe has generally adopted a more protective policy towards China. And one of the big pushes actually came through the COVID-19 pandemic in two ways, or in three ways even. The first one is that the health threat came from China. The virus originated in China. Still, we do not know how and where it came from exactly. But the fact that the Chinese authorities were extremely reluctant in cooperating with the World Health Organizations and Europeans and Americans and other governments, of course, in the world to actually fight this pandemic and understand its root causes, that has left a huge degree of distrust. The second element related to COVID-19 was the realization that Europe relies essentially in many ways on medical procurement, the procurement of medical material from China. And China used this politically, for instance, in its very early deliveries of masks to Italy, really using this also for a big PR show to demonstrate its commitment to friendship with Italy. And it also did so in other countries, later vaccine deliveries. But this kind of engagement from China never comes without an expectation. And Europeans very soon aligned that it's much better to procure for themselves and stock for themselves in a way that makes them less dependent in a crisis situation on countries like China that they felt or feel today really exploits these moments of dependency for political purposes. And the third element related to the COVID-19 crisis was the understanding that Europe was facing a period of economic recession and really strong economic troubles in a number of member states. And there was a real fear because of China's economic and financial might that it would use this opportunity to buy into European value chains and actually purchase companies that are relevant for Europe's autonomy in certain critical sectors where now the understanding in the EU is procurement should rather happen within the EU or with close allies. And so we saw an acceleration of a number of laws. One, which actually dated back a few years, was an investment control mechanism, which was implemented during the COVID-19 crisis, although the initial decision was taken much earlier. The whole debate around it was very much held under the COVID situation and a new look onto China. And so I would say the national implementation of this European regulation is far more cautious and far more restrictive than we would have seen it happen before the COVID-19 crisis. Also because the question, what is this exactly, this critical industry, this critical infrastructure that we feel we need to protect? How broad do we define the issue areas? And health by now, in addition, of course, to technology and other critical areas, is really core critical industry as seen by the European Union. So I have already mentioned that there is far more caution vis-a-vis China, and yet there's also this enormous need to cooperate. So you will see that some governments in the EU actually try to leverage their economic ties with China and their attraction that they have for China as a big country, as an economic partner. They will try to leverage this to bring China to the negotiation table and try to explain that there are very many issues of strong mutual interest that should be worked on together. Two, I have already mentioned, obviously, global health issues, as we have, unfortunately, good reasons to expect that there will be more pandemics or more waves of the existing pandemic. But secondly, also the huge issue of climate change. And here, from a European perspective, we are in a comparatively lucky situation that the Biden administration in the US fully abides by the climate agreements and the goals defined and really wants to take a proactive role in international climate negotiations and also intends to work with China. This was very different a few years back when Europe was starting to develop its own green transition. Donald Trump denied that there even was a problem with climate change. So Europe couldn't look towards the US. It, of course, looked towards China, which was already investing strongly in renewable energies and was actually leading on some technologies. And right now we see a triangle where we have the systemic competition, which I described, between China and the political West, but also I would say, interesting constellation of two of the big economic blocs, the US and Europe cooperating quite strongly, and China at least seeing the need and committing in its own way to goals of CO2 reduction. And I do think there is a strong importance that this joint agenda is being pushed forward and that all together help the global South manage their transition. Because climate transition obviously is not only a question of energy delivery and technology, it is also a huge societal challenge. So managing a just climate transition that actually supports the cohesion within societies and between states is of huge political importance for stability around the globe. Now, let me briefly turn to the current situation, and Ambassador Vimont has given so many deep insights into the situation where Europe is with regards to its own security policy and approaching its neighbor Russia, and how this had to be rethought with the invasion of Ukraine. Now, obviously, from a European perspective, the relationship between Russia and China is extremely closely observed. Over the recent weeks and months, first of all, a closer energy cooperation deal was struck with the building of an additional pipeline to export gas towards China. Financial ties have been increased, and the Chinese increasingly offer their own currency as a trading currency to replace the US dollar. I think through the current confrontation, and in particular the sanction packages that the West has imposed on Russia, and rightly so, over the past few days, this may actually accelerate. So Russia may find itself in an even closer relationship with China as the sanctions kick in and Russia has to find alternatives. However, I would stop short of saying there is really a strategic alliance building up between Russia and China. While the leaders of both countries agree in their style of governance as authoritarian states who use technology to control their societies, clamp down on the public sphere, civil society, even academia, which is controlled, there's many similarities. But from a Russian perspective, China is a very, very strong player. And giving itself into stronger dependency with China, in my view, in the long term, from a Russian perspective, cannot pay off. But I do see a danger, and I know this is shared by a number of European governments, that actually the increasing confrontation with Russia between Europe and Russia over Ukraine could actually push Russia closer to China, that this is happening. However, I do not see that we would have had a real alternative because Russia chose to invade Ukraine, to break international law, violate the territory of Ukraine and its sovereignty, and really tries to, in my view, to change the system in Ukraine and make Ukraine, as Putin has declared, it doesn't see it as a sovereign state, but as territory, which Russia wants to control. We could not have, in my view, chosen a different way as Europeans to deal with Russia before it even invaded the country. And now I think the confrontation is obvious, and the very hard line that the EU and the US have taken vis-a-vis Russia in terms of sanctions are deeply justified, and actually a very strong proof of the ability of the European Union, and Ambassador Vimont said that, to align when it has to in a deep crisis and forge a very strong position vis-a-vis another player. So China has taken a quite ambiguous position on Russia's invasion in Ukraine. It defended the principle of territorial integrity and hence criticized Russia's move, but then abstained in the International Security Council, the United Nations Security Council. So we see China treading a very, I would say, slim line at the moment in, on the one hand, criticizing Russia for an obvious, brutal violation of international principles, but on the other hand, in a way, not going as far as others in criticizing it. So I think for Europe, it will remain an important geopolitical challenge and a geo-economic challenge to deal both with the conflict with Russia in its immediate neighborhood, and it will be felt within the European Union which consequences this conflict has in terms of immigration, in terms of financial support that needs to be extended to Ukraine, the military support which is already underway through arms deliveries. But there will also very, very probably be tough economic consequences for Europe through the conflict and through the sanctions that are being imposed. So we will have a more difficult economic situation within the European Union, which makes our approach to China again more difficult, because Europe is trying to become a stronger economic actor in competition to China, tries to reach strategic autonomy, for instance, in the field of technology. And that is not only an economic question, it is really also the question whether Europe maintains its regulatory power. This shall be my concluding words. The systemic conflict with China from a European perspective plays out in very many areas. Trade, competition, investment, and all of these things are just one dimension. The real question that is overarching is whether Europe can protect its own liberal democratic model, and whether this can actually also happen in those areas where China puts the most pressure on us. I mentioned technological competition, digitization, where it is not only a question of are we competitive with regards to companies that can compete with China, and we know we can't unless we work very closely with the US. It is really the question whether we will be able to set norms and standards and protect them, at least for our space, that support our Western liberal model through data protection, through open internet, and many other things that are part of it. And the lucky situation we have at the moment is the 4 years of the Biden administration, where both sides of the Atlantic are on very many issues aligned. There may be some disagreements over some questions pertaining to tech regulation, but I think we at the moment have a base to bring the political West closer together vis-a-vis China, without forgetting that we have to work cooperatively with China, and there are welfare gains for both sides if we don't deteriorate the relationship. Thank you very much.